So now I'd like to introduce Dr. Eve Beaury, our speaker tonight. We're delighted to have her. Dr. Beaury received a PhD from the University of Massachusetts Amherst, and her area of study was spatial ecology and plant invasions in the context of climate change. She's currently at Princeton University right here in New Jersey. And I think it's going to be a very interesting and timely talk because it's going to be a long, hot summer. Climate change is really ramping up, and going to see what we can do to hopefully mitigate it. So Dr. Beaury, welcome.
Great. Thanks so much for the introduction, Mike. And I just want to say thank you all for having me in general. This is a really exciting, I think, group of people for me to engage with. Like Mike said, my background is in plant invasion ecology. And so I'm sort of a big continental scale thinker when it comes to invasions. But my group and I have been working a lot on thinking about how we can reduce invasion risk with climate change in the next couple of decades. And as I'm sure many of you know, gardens are sort of the centerpiece of how we might be thinking about that. And so what I'm going to do today is talk a lot about sort of the science and motivation behind why we might be thinking about gardens as a tool to seed ecosystems of the future, particularly in the context of climate change. And so I'm going to share a bunch of resources for how we might put that into practice, which I think is still sort of one of the big challenges we need to face, and something I hope that we have some time to get into at the Q&A. I have some questions for you all as well. So I'm excited to talk about that, but really just focusing on what are the motivations for why we need to prioritize native plant gardening, and what are some of the strategies for how we can use our gardens as a tool for helping species persist as the climate changes. And so this is sort of where we're headed today. I want to just give you a couple of slides of a brief overview of why the climate is changing and what some of the big changes we're likely to face in the Northeast are. And actually, let me just back up a second. I do want to give a shout out that all of the work I'm going to talk about today has been done in collaboration with this Northeast Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Management Network. This is a management network, or a network of researchers and practitioners that's focused on the Northeast region, including New Jersey, but it's based in Massachusetts and New England. But we have a ton of resources for the whole region. And so I think I just shared the website link for that, and I'll have resources throughout, but that's a great group to engage with, and I'll have some more information about that later. But just so you know, that's sort of the context for which I'm coming from. Like I said, this is where we're headed. I'm going to give you just a quick overview of climate change, talk about how climate change is impacting species across time and space, and then focusing most of my talk thinking about how we can use gardens to support native biodiversity, but also how gardens have historically been a major pathway for introducing invasive species and are still a major player in terms of horticultural spread of even the invasive species we already have in the United States. And so this is a really big ongoing issue. And so I hope I'm preaching to the choir a little bit when we talk about native plant gardening, but I'll give you some of the more recent research about how gardens are still functioning as a pathway for invasion. So just to give you sort of the preface, the background on climate change, I'm sure all of you are aware of this, but just in case, since the Industrial Revolution, we have been massively increasing the amount of carbon dioxide that is in our atmosphere. And so carbon dioxide is one of a handful of the major greenhouse gases that absorbs the sort of heat energy that's coming from the Earth's surface and is responsible for climate warming. But carbon dioxide is really the greenhouse gas that everybody focuses on when we talk about climate change, because it has a really long lifespan in the atmosphere. So the amount of buildup of CO2 that we're seeing in the atmosphere over these past 250 years has a really long lasting impact on our planet, because it takes a lot of time to degrade, so it really sticks around in our atmosphere. And that's why this is the greenhouse gas we focus on primarily when we're talking about climate change. The big consequences of this buildup of CO2 is that we're seeing more heat trapped in our atmosphere, which is causing our planet to get warmer. And it's majorly changing the way the air and water are moving across Earth's surfaces. So we're seeing major variations in the way that precipitation is falling across the Earth, and in general, seeing increased warming temperatures across the Earth's surface. And so I think on the next slide, okay. So our Earth has already warmed by about 1 degree Celsius since the pre-industrial averages. And most global targets are trying to limit climate warming to about 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. So by 2100, most of our global climate policies are trying to keep warming at 2 degrees Celsius or less. Right now, we're sort of on the trajectory that looks more like 3 degrees Celsius of warming. And so we have a lot of policy changes that that are already happening, but are going to continue happening in the next couple of decades to try to keep warming at this level, because there are major sort of irreversible environmental changes that happen if we allow the planet to warm past this 2 degrees Celsius. And so for us in the Northeast, I have this map up here that just sort of shows you what the trajectory looks like. If we don't make any changes, we're headed for a climate that looks much more like Georgia and South Carolina. Whereas if we start to increase these changes, this amount of climate warming is sort of inevitable, but we're going to see, less of a serious change. But either way, our climate is headed, is going to start looking a lot more like what we're seeing in regions further south from New Jersey and New England. And so I just want to point out some of the really, I think, key important changes for our region in the United States in particular. So something that's sort of unique to the Northeast US is that we're warming at a faster rate compared to everywhere else in the United States. And I don't want to get into that too much, but I can answer any questions about that. But basically, because we're at a higher latitude and because of our position relative to where the ice caps are and where the glaciers are, as those glaciers melt, there's more ocean to be absorbing heat, there's less reflectance and so on. And because of that, the northern latitudes of the United States are warming at a much faster rate relative to everywhere else. And so that's something that's really unique to our region and something that I think we all really need to be aware of. So that's really the first key important point that's unique to our region. And then the second thing is just that we are sort of characterized, not as much in New Jersey, but in New England especially, we're really characterized by unique seasons, right? And we're already starting to see these seasons bleed together in ways that they haven't before. I think this year is a really good example of how little snowfall we had in New Jersey relative to previous years. I think we had a little sprinkling of snow maybe before Christmas and one more after Christmas, but relative to the median level of snow across cities in the Northeast, we were pretty much at zero, compared to historical standards. And so we're already sort of losing this idea of the seasonality that so many of our plant species and animal species are well adapted to, and I think is really sort of socially and culturally iconic about our region as well. And so that sort of changing idea of what the seasons look like and how they line up against each other is also something that's very unique to our region. And then something that's very critical across the world, but again, for New Jersey to think about, is that we're seeing, because of climate warming and this buildup of CO2, we're seeing an increase in the frequency and magnitude of extreme events. And when I say extreme events, I pretty much just mean, major heat waves, coastal flooding, big storms, like these really sort of exaggerated extreme weather events that happen in a shorter time period. They're becoming more frequent and bigger in magnitude. And so this is really becoming our norm, right? We're going to have intense periods of drought followed by intense periods of rain. And it's just going to feel a lot more erratic in terms of these major storms. And so I just pulled some headlines of what that looks like for the last couple of years in New Jersey. Something like, increasing hurricane size and magnitude and frequency is something that we just, we're already seeing and need to continue expecting for our region. And across the earth, this is happening everywhere. And then just the sort of last point about climate change that I want to leave you with is that we've seen these types of major climate oscillations throughout Earth's history, but what's really unique about what's going on right now is that the climate is changing so much faster than it ever has naturally in the past. And so this graph, you can kind of see that in the fact that where our current climate is in terms of our CO2 levels is basically way squished at the end of that right-hand graph. So when you hear sort of people deny and say like, oh, the climate has changed so many times in the past, it's really incomparable to what's happening now because of the rate that we're seeing the climate change so quickly in such a short amount of time. And so, this is putting a ton of pressure on, both our ecosystems, but also our societies to try to adjust and adapt over such a short period of time. So, part of what I want to emphasize today is that we have to sort of make decisions about what the future is going to look like, even though we have tons of uncertainty and there's still a lot that could change. But we're sort of forced with this question of what do we do now to try to prevent these big impacts from happening because of how fast these changes are occurring. And so just to recap this sort of preface on climate change, we have this buildup of CO2, temperatures are rising across the Earth's surface. It's causing this increasing, magnitude and frequency of extreme events. The Northeast in particular is seeing more warming and more erratic precipitation changes relative to anywhere else in the United States. And that all of these changes are happening incredibly fast. And so now I want to talk about what some of the impacts of these climate changes can be on our ecosystems. And of course, all of this sort of extreme stress of the climate and the environment is causing direct impacts on species in terms of their, their physiology, their ability to reproduce and find food and things like that. But specifically what I want to focus on as a spatial ecologist is how climate is impacting species across space and over time. So one of the major ways that climate change is affecting species is through their preferred ranges or their habitats. And so we're already starting to see that species are moving around to new areas to try to track their preferred climates. And this is one example from the East Coast. We're starting to see that white-tailed deer are expanding northward into regions that were historically colder, but are now becoming more hospitable for the deer. There's more plants for them to eat. And so they're starting to move northward. And what's happening is that they're starting to sort of clash into the southern part of the moose range. And they're carrying all these sort of nasty diseases and ticks and things that moose typically haven't experienced before into the southern range of moose. And so we're starting to see these species interact in ways that we never have before, because typically their ranges were more separated because of this climate gradient. And then on the northern end, that's happening in the same way. Moose are expanding northward and they're starting to replace caribou. As you can sort of see from this map, caribou don't have a lot of room to move northward. I mean, as sea ice melts, there's sort of more land area, but it's not really like rich in resources or anything like that. And so basically species ranges are starting to sort of condense and collapse northward. That's pushing species to compete in ways that we haven't seen them before. And like I said, they're sort of carrying their diseases and ticks and all their sort of nasty things into new ranges. And so we're starting to sort of see this northward expansion of species that's already happening fairly quickly in the Northeast. And then in the plant world, we're starting to see a very similar thing in terms of our tree species. And so these are maps from the U.S. Department of Agriculture Climate Change Tree Atlas, which is a huge resource that looks at predicted shifts of species ranges with climate change for a bunch of trees in the Northeast. And so I'm showing you the example for hemlock. Eastern hemlock. So on the left is the areas that are currently suitable for hemlock. The darker blue colors are the highest suitability, which is basically the best habitat for hemlock. And then on the right side, you can see how that might change under a high emissions scenario, which is basically like our business as usual. If we don't cut our carbon emissions, this is what our climate is going to look like in 50 years. And you can see that there's major contractions for hemlock's range. It's a little bit tricky because it's small, but if you look at sort of that coastal New England, you can see this chunk of habitat around the coast that was really suitable for hemlock is basically shifting towards Canada or shifting towards northern Maine. And so we're already seeing these sort of dramatic shifts in habitat for some of our really sort of iconic keystone species on the East Coast. And part of the reason why this is climate related and sort of invasion related is that as many of you may know, hemlocks are highly threatened by the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an invasive pest species that I'm showing in this picture. Those are the sort of egg sacs of an infested hemlock tree. And so the hemlock woolly adelgid was further south. It's now moving north because there's warmer winters. And so it's able to overwinter much easier than it had previously. And so it's really sort of spreading into the deepest part of the hemlock's range. And so hemlocks are sort of suffering from both the shifted climate change, so that it's losing habitat because temperatures are getting too warm for it, as well as increased invasion from this pest species that's sort of benefiting from climate change. And so we're already starting to see our native species are struggling to sort of keep pace with climate change at the same time as certain invasive species are actually benefiting from this increase in habitat suitability. And this is not uncommon. These types of range shifts are happening across many different invasive species. And so this is just showing you an example of another range map for invasive wineberry, which is an invasive plant we have in sort of this mid-Atlantic region of the United States. This is a model that collaborators and I worked on to try to understand, how species are shifting under a scenario of 2 degrees Celsius of warming. So, pretty much where we're headed by the end of century. In that lightish red region, you can see all of the areas where wineberry is going to persist with climate change. There's kind of an interesting big blue chunk, which is all the areas that wineberry is going to lose suitable habitat with climate change. And so you might have reduced invasion risk there. And then those dark red areas are really critical because those are the areas that are going to become more suitable for invasion. So higher risk of invasion with climate change. And so you're seeing this sort of contraction in part of the range, but a major expansion of this species across sort of its range in the eastern US. And so places like Pennsylvania and New England that may not have thought about this as a potential invasive species before are seeing that this species might sort of start to march into new places. And this was true. We did this model for 144 invasive species, invasive plants on the East Coast of the United States. And we found that pretty much all of the plants that we did this type of modeling for are going to have suitable habitat for invasion in new areas. And so the East Coast, and particularly the Northeast, is going to see this influx of new invasive plants that we haven't seen before that are already invading further south. And that's sort of exactly what's shown on this map here. If you take all of those range maps and sort of stack them together, this is sort of like your number of invasive species that are on the way with climate change. You can see where we are in New Jersey, and this sort of New York, Pennsylvania range is really just going to become a hub for species moving northward to track their preferred climates. And so we basically have a lot of risk associated with invasions that are already happening further south that are going to become, prevalent invaders here in the, in our region of the US. And so really, like, what I want to say in terms of gardens and thinking about gardens as a vector of invasive plant spread is that we need to be on the lookout for weedy species that are on the move. So if we're thinking about planting new species, experimenting with climate change and movement, we have to be really careful that we're not helping species track their climate as they're, already going to have suitable habitat in our region. And I'll say more about that later, but just know that range shifts are this, a huge component of what we're seeing in terms of how climate change is affecting species. Another thing that's happening is that we're seeing a longer growing season pretty much across the United States. This study looked at that across a pretty big time span, and they found that in the East Coast and the Northeast, we're seeing an increase in the annual number of growing degree days by about 10 days. And so that may not seem like a lot, but it's already sort of getting longer. The study's from 2014, and a study I'm going to talk about later estimates that to be like something like 30 days, depending on the species you look at. And so there's potential that we have a whole additional month added to our growing season when we're thinking about gardening and when we're thinking about managing invasions in different species. So we're already starting to see shorter winters and longer summers. And that's not sort of an objectively or good or bad thing, but it just basically means that a lot of our flora and fauna have been pre-adapted to the shorter growing season. And if we have this change in conditions coupled with the increase in extreme events, it could be really rough. So if you think about this longer growing season, that means our pollinators need more floral resources, plants need more resources to grow. But if you pair that with something like an extreme drought or an extreme flood, species might be at greater risk of dying or losing populations under these conditions. And so, sort of in the same as the other example, you have this like thing that might be bad for native species that also might actually be good for invasive species. Here are two examples. So Eurasian milfoil, which is an aquatic invasive plant, and then our same hemlock woolly adelgid, which is the pest of the hemlock trees. There's been research that shows that both of these species are actually benefiting from a longer growing season. So because they can outcompete native species, they have more time to lay eggs, they have more time to sort of accumulate biomass. They're actually becoming better competitors with climate change. They're really benefiting from this longer growing season. And I didn't have time to put this in here, but I actually read a paper this morning of something very similar where they were looking at the growing season for invasive versus native shrubs across the full length of the East Coast. And they found that the invasive shrubs are emerging about 40 days earlier and senescing about 40 days later compared to native shrubs. So the native shrubs are still sort of occupying their historical growing season length in terms of when they, leaf bud break and when they senesce, but the invasive shrubs are adding 2 whole months to the growing season. So if you think about the ability to sort of get big and get weedy in those 2 extra months where you basically don't have competitors, that's really crazy. And that can really sort of run away into something that becomes, a really bad invasion. And so we're starting to accumulate more and more evidence for how this longer growing season is starting to benefit, not only invasive plants, but these pests as well. And one of the sort of additional consequences of this changing in the growing season is that we're seeing shifts in the cues that species are responding to. And that can cause mismatches in the timing of when species typically interact. So there are a lot of species that sort of start their spring based on the amount of hours of daylight, which, isn't changing because of climate change. But there are other species who are, come out of their eggs when it gets warm enough. And so because that's changing with climate change and other species aren't, we're starting to see this like change and this disjunct in time in terms of when species are interacting. And so just an example from this 2007 paper, which is a while ago now, but they looked at a bunch of insect species in the Midwestern United States, and they found that up to 50% of pollinating species are going to experience some kind of disruption in food supply because of climate change. So basically that means that the timing that the pollinators are out and about, they're looking for nectar, they're pollinating flowers, is not overlapping with the main flowering time period of a lot of their host species. And so we're already sort of seeing the shift in the growing season start to cause species to not overlap in ways that they used to. That's really sort of critical for these key life history events. And so the take home here is really just that, climate change is driving these major changes across space and over time that we already have a lot of evidence for. We're already seeing species move around in new places, and we're seeing these changes in life history events. And a lot of these changes are actually going to advantage invasive species. So at the same time that our native species might be more vulnerable to change, our invasive species are sort of able to take advantage of these changes. And then the other thing is that not all species are going to keep pace with change. So if you remember that map about the hemlock trees, hemlocks can disperse over certain distances, but the pace at which the climate is changing is really sort of way faster than most species are able to naturally move. So if you have wings or you can move around, like, you might have a better time. But for a lot of our plant species in particularly, they just can't disperse fast enough to keep pace with these rapid changes in climate change. And so we really need to be doing something to help our native species persist and help them track their preferred habitats. And so that's, exactly where this idea of gardens as sort of an ecological tool to seed the ecosystems of the future come in. Gardens are really interesting because there's sort of this unique interface between our sort of human-dominated and more natural systems. And that's really exciting. Because of that, we can use gardens to try to think about how we can allow native species or populations to persist in the face of these environmental changes. So we want to think about gardens both in terms of benefiting native species, but also reducing the spread and advantages of invasive species, which I'll get to later. I just want to sort of start this section with a quote from Doug Tallamy, who I think is presented at this webinar series prior to, at some point in time. He's a plant ecologist and entomologist that has done a lot of really nice writing and research on the benefits of native gardening. I would recommend his book if you haven't seen it. But basically, he said that we need to be thinking about our gardens as wildlife preserves that represent the last chance we have for sustaining plants and animals that were once common throughout the United States. And so really trying to focus on our gardens as this connection to natural areas that we have control over, and that has huge impacts on what our ecosystems look like. And so if we're thoughtful about how we use our gardens, we might really have the potential to have a positive impact on what, nearby forests and meadows and, other types of ecosystems look like. And so basically, we're kind of coining this as trying to think about gardens as these stepping stones or these habitat patches that help species, connect to natural areas and potentially persist with climate change. So we can think about our gardens as sort of these mini preserves that are providing this habitat that might allow species to adapt to environmental changes locally. And so this is not a totally new idea. As I'm sure you all know, pollinator gardens have really become so popular in the last couple of years, more so than at least any other gardening trend I've ever seen. And so that's super exciting. It's not a wild idea to think about, how your garden can help support local species populations. But what we really need to be doing is starting to expand on something like this trend to think about what other types of species we can support with our gardens. So not just, helping pollinator population persist, but helping plant populations persist as well. And just to extend that a little bit further, we want to start thinking about really what species we can help persist with climate change in terms of, gardens as stepping stones into natural areas locally, but also gardens as stepping stones to help species track their preferred climate. So what should or maybe could be in our gardens as the climate changes is really what I want to focus on for the next section of my talk. And really what I'm talking about is thinking about using gardens as a tool for assisted migration with climate change. So it's trying to broaden the scale at which we're thinking about gardens as these habitat patches that can help species move, from something like, Pennsylvania, New Jersey up to New England. So how can we think about our gardens as helping species sort of climb that ladder of climate change? And so, so for the next part of my talk, I'm just going to focus specifically on this idea of assisted migration. So these broader, sort of more regional, geographic species movements and how gardens can play a role in that. Just as a little sort of preface to assisted migration, this is defined as the intentional introduction of species outside of their historic ranges into more climatically favorable regions. So intentionally taking species and moving them to new areas, ideally to help them migrate faster than they would be able to do so on their own. There are several different strategies that we can use to approach assisted migration. The first is known as assisted population migration, and this is the idea of moving seed sources or populations to new location within the historical species range. So that's sort of shown on this map. You're not taking anything outside of where we know it has native, it grows natively or it's sort of naturally evolved, but you're just sort of taking populations from the southern end of the range and helping to sort of shift them northward. So we know that, like in this instance, if you're in, the middle of Idaho, you might be adapted to slightly warmer temperatures than if you're up in Canada. And so maybe those Idaho populations can help, if we take those populations and move them, they're already sort of pre-adapted to what the climate's going to look like in another decade or two. And so trying to think about using those southern chunks of a species range to help, move those populations intentionally so that species can start to move forward. Another approach to assisted migration is assisted range expansion. And so this is the idea of moving populations from their current range to suitable areas beyond their historical species range. So this is actually taking, something or a population or a species outside of this green area and moving it to somewhere new because we think that maybe that area will be more suitable for climate change. And so rather than sort of operating within the safety net of where we know species already occur, trying to think a little bit broader and moving species outside of their historical ranges. And then the last approach to assisted migration is assisted species migration. And this is sort of similar to the second approach, but it's a little bit different because it's thinking about moving populations to a location that's way far outside of its historical range. So beyond the locations accessible by natural dispersal, whereas the middle one, you can kind of think of it as like taking something from not that far away and moving it a little bit farther northward, whereas C is really like taking something from, like this map shows, Florida and moving it way outside of the range and seeing what happens. And so these are sort of different approaches to assisted migration that vary in terms of how far we're moving species, but also they really vary in terms of how risky they are for causing something like an invasion. So from invasion biology, we know pretty well that when you move species outside of their historical native ranges, when they interact in new areas, they might have some advantages and they might be able to spread and sort of take over. So for these two approaches for assisted migration, we need to be really careful because we already know from invasion biology that this can cause, major environmental damages, even if you think you're doing something good. You think you're helping a species move along in the right direction, but just as soon as you move it outside of its historical range, it can really, spread. So I'm going to talk about sort of what the risks are associated with that in a little bit. But before I sort of talk about some of the more negative side to assisted migration, I want to talk about the approach all the way to the left, which again is sort of like this is our safest bet for assisted migration. So keeping species within the areas where we know they've naturally evolved or they or naturally natively occur, and just sort of thinking about moving populations within a species range. So as gardeners, I'll tell you, I think I have an example here. Yeah, okay, so I have one example of just what this looks like, and then I'll sort of talk about some of the resources we have for making these types of decisions. So just to show you an example of moving populations to new locations within historical species ranges, Tug Hill State Forest, which is in New York State, I have it on the little map there. They were doing tons of restoration of the forest, and they were trying to think about whether, there's a lot of species in their forest that weren't doing that well because of climate change. They were more cold adapted and they weren't doing well with hotter, drier summers. And so they were trying to think strategically about how to restore the state park without, just trying to plant species that aren't going to do well with climate change. And so what they did is they sourced all of their tree stock, their seeds and their seedlings, of the same tree species that were already there, but they went south and got populations that were already doing well in warmer temperatures and basically brought them further north and planted them, and they've had major success. And so the warm adapted populations of the same trees that were already there are doing way better and are actually helping the trees that were already there and not well adapted to climate change sort of adjust better through reproduction. And so this is a huge success story, I think, in terms of thinking about assisted migration, of bringing populations from a little bit further south up to the north, and you're sort of benefiting from their natural adaptations that they've had when they're already sort of adjusted to these warmer climates. And so this is just one example of how this, can be useful in terms of a restoration context, but I think it also be applied to gardens. And so as gardeners, we can start to think about how we might make this kind of decision about, okay, so I have my garden, some of these species might not do so well with climate change. They need more irrigation, they need more help. Maybe there's populations or seed stock that we can start to source from further south. And if you're a nursery, that you can start to bring north to help deal with that. And hardiness zones, I think, are a really useful tool for thinking about this. And so I'm assuming most people in the crowd are using hardiness zones already, but it's basically like, a binning of plants preferred climate zone. And so this map I'm showing you is the sort of historical hardiness zones for our region, which you can see are something like, I think it's like 8 and 7. And then the US Department of Agriculture did modeling projects to try to figure out what our hardiness zones are going to look like in the future so that we can start to get a sense of what plants are actually going to do well here. And you can see that, the hardiness zones have shifted pretty dramatically towards the warmer zones. And so that's just sort of reflecting average changes in temperature and precipitation. But we can use these hardiness zone shifts to think about, okay, like what plants are already doing well under like a 7-8 regime and are going, they might have populations further south in an 8-9 regime. And maybe those are the types of species I should really be focusing on planting rather than species that are like, okay, maybe they're like a 6-7. Those hardiness zones are pretty much disappearing from our state. And so these species aren't going to be doing well in another decade or so, or maybe even on a shorter time scale. And so thinking about hardiness zones as this, useful information tool for thinking about, where we're headed in the future and what plants are going to do well here because of that. And so my research group has tried to come up with gardening resources to help you make those decisions. And so this, includes New Jersey, but is a little bit more specific to further north in New England, but I think it could still apply. Basically, we've come up with a list of native species, different grasses, flowering herbs, shrubs, whatever, that's longer than this than you can see here. And identify their hardiness zones. So these are species that are already located in New England, but they're sort of at the northern range margins for where they can already exist, but they're doing really well further south. And so those are the species that we want to help persist, right? Those are the species that we want to help track their climate. We know they're going to fare well as our climate looks more like the South. And so this is really, I think, where our best bet is in terms of thinking about native plant gardening or selecting species that are going to fare well with climate change. So you can see we've sort of listed the hardiness zones that are spanning the range of hardiness zones that we already have, as well as the hardiness zones that we're going to shift, are going to be more likely to occur with climate change. We've also noted some growing conditions, as well as which ones of these species have potential ecological benefits. So is there research that suggests, these species support high numbers of hummingbirds or other pollinators? This is the flower color. They're deer resistant and they're low maintenance. And so this is sort of, I think we know some people that have started to experiment with this. This has just kind of come out in the last couple of years. And so I'd be curious to know what this group thinks about this in terms of like a resource to think about, what is your garden going to look like in the future? What species do you maybe already have, or what species haven't you thought of yet that could be really suitable for climate change? Okay, so coming back to our outline again, we know that that was this, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but if you can, that was this sort of method of assisted migration, which is pretty much our safest bet, just moving species within their historical ranges. And then these approaches on the right are a little bit more risky because we're moving species over further distances, which, like I said, can cause invasions. But the third approach to assisted migration is actually the one I'm going to talk about next, which is moving populations to a location really far outside of their range. And this can cause invasions, but it's, some of these are not all risky all the time. Basically, like, I'm going to try to make the argument that if we're thoughtful about how we approach this, it's not always going to cause an invasion. And there's some really useful tools we have to try to think about this. So if we're moving species outside of their historical ranges, we need to be really careful about it. But we do have some pieces of information that can help us try to assess whether something's going to become invasive or whether this type of assisted migration is really, a useful tool. Okay, so moving populations to locations far outside of their historical ranges, like I said, can cause invasions. I'll talk about that later. But again, can be a really useful tool at the same time. And so just to give you one example, Torreya taxifolia is a tree. It's a huge conifer tree that used to be all up and down the east coast of the United States. And there's other species across the US that before glaciation, so before our last glacial maximum, when most of the United States down to Massachusetts was pretty much covered in ice, this tree basically lost a ton of its range. It's adapted to a little bit cooler temperatures and microclimates. And right now it's pretty much it used to only be confined to Florida. And so it's pretty much lost most of its historical range on the East Coast because of a climate oscillation that happened a long time ago. And now, as climate is getting warmer, this tree is really, really struggling. It's a slow growing species. It's not able to disperse very far. And so it's pretty much trapped in its area in Florida where it's like finding these cooler microclimates. And so there's this really awesome citizen or community scientist group that was really, interested in saving this. They're like conservation group across this genus of trees. And they learned about this endangered tree that's now believed to be one of the most endangered conifer trees in the United States. And they wanted to do something about it. So they knew this species was really range restricted to Florida, and they wanted to figure out what they could do to keep it around as this kind of iconic, culturally important species. And so what they did is they went to Florida and collected a bunch of seeds and then started planting the trees in botanical gardens and different areas, from North Carolina to Pennsylvania, pretty much, which is the extent of where we knew this tree used to exist before we had a climate oscillation that caused glaciers. And so basically they've been experimenting with trying to reestablish populations of this tree far outside of where it currently is located, but where we know it historically occurred. So we are sort of expanding this across a large distance, but with some information about the historical range, and they've been wildly successful. So now there's a self-sustaining population in North Carolina. I think they're experimenting with doing this for other populations and moving them further northward. But basically, because they wanted to save this one tree, they sort of did their homework to figure out what climates were most suitable, whether or not it was going to become invasive. And the key to that really is that they know that this is a slow-growing tree that has low dispersal. And so if you know anything about invasives, you know that they're really fast growing, they disperse really well. And so, we have an example species that pretty much has the opposite traits. And because of that, there was not a lot of risk associated with that. It's going to take forever to grow. It's not going to ever become a weedy species. And so there's not really a risk with moving it outside of its far outside of its range. And so this is an example, I think, of successful assisted migration in which they took a really critical assessment and thought about the traits of the species, decided it wasn't a risk, but decided it was worth saving, and then moved it further north. And so this is, I think, a positive example of assisted migration that went really well because they were really thoughtful about it. And so coming back to our outline, I know I said that that type of assisted migration can cause invasions, but it can be a safe bet if we're really critical when we approach it. So these sort of approaches on the end are I think, where we need to be thinking about assisted migration in gardens. All of these approaches vary in risk, but also doing nothing is causing harm. We have to help these species move along. There are just native species that are not going to be able to keep up, and we really should be doing something about that. And so for the next chunk of my talk, I know I've sort of alluded to a lot of stuff about invasions, but I want to talk more specifically about thinking about gardens as a pathway for invasions and how assisted range expansion of non-native species has caused, a lot of environmental harm, a lot more harm than good. So this middle approach of moving species outside of their native ranges, not necessarily over far distances, but even within the United States and what that can cause. So we know pretty well at this point from invasions, across Earth's history, but also, specific to the United States, if you move a species outside of its historical native range, it could become invasive. So one example is black locust in the Northeast. This is a tree. This map in the middle is showing you its native range in green. So these are all the areas where we know black locust has historically occurred. Folks in New England thought okay, this is it's a beautiful tree. It, is native to a region that's pretty, close to us. Why don't we plant it in Connecticut and Massachusetts and see what happens? So really, it's not a large jump, but they thought they would move it outside of its historical range, make it a popular ornamental tree in New England. And the consequence has been that black locust has spread outside of cultivation and become really, really weedy and invasive in riparian areas. It's a nitrogen fixing tree, so it changes the soil chemistry and basically benefits the spread of other invasive species and really outcompetes native species. And it's really tricky to get rid of. And so this is now a state prohibited plant in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New York, and Maine. And so this is just to illustrate that's not a far jump outside of a species historical range, but even just that distance of movement has, ultimately resulted in a pretty widespread invasion in New England, and something that is likely going to get worse with climate change. And so this is sort of the opposite example of the torreya tree, where we thought we were moving a species, we thought it could be useful for gardening, but we weren't that careful about thinking about its traits and the potential for it to become invasive. And because of that, it's been able to spread successfully and outcompete our native species. And so this is sort of the dark side of thinking about gardens as our stepping stones for biodiversity, because gardens have also become these major stepping stones for invasive species to spread into natural areas, way exceeding dispersal rates for anything that could happen naturally. We're pretty much helping invasive species move along really rapidly and readily through our gardens. And so just to put some numbers behind that, this is from a study that came out in 2013. They put together a list of about 1,000 invasive plants that we have in the United States, and they basically tracked down how those species first got to the US. So these are all non-native to North America. They were imported here, arrived here, from another country. And so they tracked down all those introduction pathways. They found that for about 130 of the species, which are shown in red, they were accidentally introduced, with the biggest, player being seed contaminants. So shipments of other products that had seed contaminants in them. That's a major vector of spread. But the majority of invasive plants were actually intentionally introduced to the United States. And you can see that the biggest chunk there is the ornamental trade industry, so horticulture. So the import of non-native plants through horticulture for gardening is the main vector of invasive plant spread, or basically the main vector for non-native species into the United States. Those non-native species then escape horticulture and become invasive in our natural areas. So the majority of invasive plants that we have in the United States arrived here through horticulture. These are just some examples of some of the common horticultural invasive introductions in the Northeast. On the left is purple loosestrife. This is a wetland invader that is really, really weedy and competitive. Originally brought here as this beautiful flower. So that's one example. The one in the middle is Chinese silvergrass. This is an invasive that's sort of up and coming a little bit further south from here. It was originally introduced as this grass. We are compiling more evidence that it's a fire-prone grass. And so as you're seeing environments in the East Coast, where we don't typically have wildfires that often, we're becoming drier, and we're seeing the spread of a fire-prone invasive grass like this. That could change, right? We could start seeing more wildfires for something like this. And this was a horticultural introduction. And then the one all the way on the right is one I'm sure many of you have recognized. It's really popular in New England. I don't know about as much about New Jersey, but it's pretty much in everybody's yards in New England. It's Japanese barberry. This is a thorny invasive shrub. The bottom right picture is one that of, a very early season growth of barberry, where you can see like pretty much nothing else is growing on this forest understory. And it's pretty much like preventing anything else from coming up. And so this is one that you see like beautifully, neatly cultivated in lots of gardens and lots of lawns. And if you go on a trail down the road, like it's there. And so, these horticultural introductions are really spreading in our natural areas. And so a few years ago, because we knew, this is a pretty well-established pathway at this point. For the last 20, 30 years, we've known very well that horticulture is responsible for, bringing species into the United States that then escape cultivation and spread and become invasive. And so what my research group was interested in a couple of years ago was, how often is this still happening? We now have this list of invasive species. We know they're invasive. We know they can spread. Are they still being marketed as garden plants in the United States? Or have we done a good job sort of taking them off the market now that we know that they're invasive? And I won't go into the details, but basically we found that more than half of our invasive plants in the United States are still being marketed as ornamental garden plants, at least somewhere in the United States. So again, this is, species that are on the federal noxious weed list. They're on state prohibited plant lists. They have really well documented negative impacts in natural areas. And we're still seeing a huge proportion of them being sold online and sold in retail garden centers, very readily. And so the map I have here, it's just one example of what that looks like and sort of how the regulations vary for an individual species. Glossy buckthorn is an invasive plant here in the Northeast, but also in the Midwest US. All of the states that are colored in are states that consider buckthorn to be a prohibited plant. And then all of the gray dots there are the nurseries that we found selling buckthorn as an ornamental species. And so you can see that even in areas that consider this to be, highly weedy, highly invasive, nurseries are still selling them legally to people down the street. And so there's a huge mismatch here, I think, in terms of how often we're spreading these things as garden plants and how many other resources we're using, in state governments and management to try to get rid of them for our natural areas. So it's a really weird feedback loop that I think we have not done a great job closing in the last couple of years. And then the other thing I want to say is just that, not only is horticulture a main vector for importing non-native plants that become invasive, but it's also the primary pathway for importing non-native pests and diseases that come invasive. So this is from a study that estimated that up to 70% of our non-native forest pests in the United States arrived as contaminants on nursery plant imports. So we imported a plant, the bug came with it, and it really spread in natural areas. And so two examples of that are sudden oak death and hemlock woolly adelgid. You've now seen hemlock woolly adelgid a handful of times throughout my talk, which is, really affecting hemlock populations in New England. And so, not only are plants coming into the US, but they're bringing all this nasty stuff with it that's really affecting our native species that aren't well adapted to these types of things. And so, obviously, one of the reasons the gardens are such a major pathway for spreading invasive species is because a huge proportion of nursery stock in the United States are non-native to North America. So we're importing species from other countries and spreading them throughout the United States. And we know from the literature, from the research now, that non-native species are much, much more likely to become invasive compared to native species that were sort of moving around within the United States. So, it may not be native to everywhere in the US, but if it's native to our continent or native to the United States, it's much less likely to become invasive than something that we're importing from another country. And so this is a study that basically quantified that exact thing. It's from a while ago now, but basically they looked at the pool of plants that are non-native to the United States but occur in natural areas, and the pool of plants that are native to the United States they could find documented in websites. And then they tallied up the number of species that are defined as invasive somewhere else in the United States. And you can see that non-native plants are 40 times more likely to become invasive than native plants. And basically the definition of invasive here is just that it's able to spread rapidly in natural areas and pretty much outcompete native plants. And so it's kind of establishing this monoculture in a way that we don't see in most of our native biodiversity. And so there's a much higher invasion risk associated with importing non-native plants than with something like gardening with native species. And this is a huge problem because there's been a ton of research that's come out in the last couple of years that are quantifying the benefits of native plants versus non-native plants. So even if you have a non-native plant that's not going to become invasive, maybe it's just sort of hanging out, doing nothing so spectacular, it's not providing nearly as many of the ecological benefits that native biodiversity provide or native plant gardening provides. And so this is sort of a synthesis of work by Doug Tallamy, who I quoted earlier, and a handful of other people that estimated that there's a much higher abundance and diversity of birds and pollinators when you have landscapes that are dominated by native plants compared to landscapes that are dominated by native species. And so they estimated that if you want to get all these ecological benefits out of your gardens, you really should be aiming for less than 30% of your garden to be non-native. If you have more than 30% of non-native plants in your garden, you're likely starting to lose these benefits in terms of diversity of pollinators, birds, and as we know, those sorts of population gains can really affect what's going on a broader landscape. We're losing pollinators. We need birds. We need these sort of intact food webs, and your garden can really play a critical role in that as long as it has enough native plants to sort of get these benefits out of it. And this is kind of an interesting concept because this is like the support of pollinators and birds and things like that is exactly why non-native species are more likely to become invasive. So if you think about this, you have native plants in your garden, they're being eaten by a bunch of native insects and pollinators and whatever. And so they sort of are part of this intact food web that's sort of managing their population density. Your non-native plants are not being munched on by all of these things. They're not really interacting with as many species. And so if you're not spending all your time sort of fighting off herbivores or defending yourself, you have a lot of time and energy that you can spend growing. And so they basically have this release from their natural enemies that allows them to become really abundant. And so they're escaping your garden. They're not being eaten by anything in the forest. And so there's basically nothing controlling their population density, and they can just take off. And so in our gardens, we're seeing these sort of benefits of native plants in terms of supporting all this these food webs and these different species. And then in natural areas for non-native species, when they escape, they're like basically getting this benefit from not having herbivores or supporting these higher level food webs. So they're really just taking off in terms of their population growth. And then another reason why non-native species are so much more likely to become invasive is because they tend to be more disease resistant. And so they lack this sort of co-evolutionary history with all these other species. They're kind of not interacting with anything when they show up. And so they, again, have this benefit, like if you're not fighting off disease or you're not you're not really competing with anything, you have this growth advantage. You have more energy that you can spend getting big and bushy and weedy and so on. And so a really powerful example of that is the chestnut blight. We imported Japanese chestnut as an ornamental tree. When we brought it to the United States, it brought chestnut blight, which is a disease that really just like wiped out pretty much most of the chestnut populations across the eastern United States. The Japanese tree was well adapted to dealing with the disease. It wasn't fatal. It just sort of lived with it, or, was fatal in some instances, but not like an extinction risk. And basically our American chestnut had never been exposed to anything like it. So it was completely vulnerable to the disease and, major deaths, loss of population across the East Coast of the United States. Right now they're trying to breed blight resistant chestnuts to try to bring chestnuts back, because chestnuts used to be one of the biggest trees and sort of keystone species in East Coast forests, and that's really changed in the last 50 years. And so people are trying to bring it back, but this is an example of an ornamental horticultural import that has really like bled into natural areas and had a huge impact on the way our forests are structured in the East Coast. And so the take home here is really just that, we need to be thinking about our gardens as this powerful tool for good, but at the same time, we have this historical context that moving some species around is riskier than others. We know that there's potential invasion risk associated with non-native species, and in general, they're providing fewer ecological benefits. And so really, this is all just to say, and like, again, preaching to the choir a little bit, but like we need to be prioritizing native plant gardening because there's so many more ecological benefits and lower invasion risk, and using gardens as the stepping stone for native species to persist with climate change is such a better, like a more exciting ecological idea than continuing to do what we've done, historically, which is just help these non-native species spread and move around. And it's just had, some of the impacts are staggering. And so we have this opportunity to sort of try to shift this industry towards native plant gardening. And it just has so many benefits if we are able to do that. And the other thing I'll say is that, like I said, the sort of Torreya tree or the rare endangered tree is the good example of assisted migration. There's lots of examples where assisted migration has sort of gone wrong. I think something that's been really exciting that's come out of the literature in the last couple of years is just that we have tons of tools and resources for trying to start to assess these risks. So how do we avoid a case like black locust where we didn't move it that far and it became a huge problem versus something else where we might move it, a shorter distance or a longer distance and we know that it's a pretty safe bet. So how do we make sure we're ensuring safe bets and not doing anything so risky? These are just some sort of questions that we can ask ourselves. Is it actually going to help the target species? So if I move this thing or I try to get native stock from further south from here, is it actually going to do anything? Is it going to be able to grow? How does it interact with other species? Is it going to interact with species if I move it to a new place? And then, will people support this action, or is this something that could cause more harm than good? And so I know these are really general questions, but this is just to sort of summarize some frameworks we have for thinking about, when to select a species for assisted migration versus when to not. And then another thing we've done in my group is to try to pick some traits that are very specific and common in invasive species and say like, hey, if you have a native species and you're thinking about moving it, but maybe it's really dominant in its native range, it's maybe a little disturbance responsive, or it's nitrogen fixing, that's a more risky species than something that's a little bit more rare. Maybe it has slower growth rates, or, it has a lot of herbivores that like to eat it and so on. And so trying to think about these sort of very general plant traits as a way to sort of sort out like, what are my safer bets versus what is a little bit more risky when I'm thinking about moving a species around. And then the other thing is that we have these sort of thought exercises that we can go through and trait resources that we can think about. And then there's also something we've been working on a lot in the last couple of years in my group is trying to work with federal and state policymakers to make sure that, our invasive species regulations are really up to snuff. Are we making sure that if we still have so many species being spread around as garden plants, whether or not it's intentional, we need to make sure that we're way reducing the rates in terms of when that's happening so that we actually have an opportunity to prioritize native gardening. So let's shift away from the invasive species, shift away from the non-native species, and prioritize the native species. And one of the tools we have to do that are state regulations. And so we have a federal noxious weed list, which is about 100 species. Many of them were horticultural introductions. They're now some of the worst weeds we have in the United States. And so those are species that we really want to make sure that we're not moving around unintentionally or intentionally. And then at the state level, most states in the US have their own list that's about 600 species in total. That is, if it's on the list, it says it's a prohibited plant in this list. They're very sort of state centric, but we need to be, we can use these lists as a resource to think like, all right, there's an ornamental plant I really like in Virginia. Maybe we should move it up here, but this list would be telling you don't do that. And so we've done a lot of work on trying to understand how these sort of policy mechanisms work. But if you are gardening with non-native species, this is pretty much your authority resource for saying this is not something you should have in your garden. And as we know from that previous study, people are still selling them whether or not they're on the regulated list. So do your due diligence as customers and make sure that you're not moving any of these things around. And like I said, we've done a bunch of analyses to try to understand how effective these regulations are. And try to understand some areas where we could try to build climate change into these lists more explicitly. Basically, the short story is that, like many things in the United States, every state is sort of up to their own thing. They use the list very differently. There's different species on them. There's a lot of variation in how many species are regulated per state, and not a lot of overlap in the state, like these state lists. But still, I think they're a really useful resource. We found that, if you're on the Massachusetts state regulated list, you're not going to be sold in trade in Massachusetts. If you're not on the list in New York, you might be sold there and you could drive into Massachusetts, and that's a problem. But in general, like, the lists work. We just need to make sure that they're up to date and, have all the species on them that they should. And so that's something we've been spending a lot of time on in the last couple of years. And I'll just note that New Jersey used to be like a little Xed off thing in this map. Prior to this year, New Jersey had no legislation on invasive species in terms of like a prohibited plant list through horticulture. And people with the New Jersey Strike Team are working on building one now. And so there should be, hopefully in the next year or two, a prohibited plant list in New Jersey, which says like, these are the species we don't want in horticultural trade. They're risks to New Jersey natural resources. And so that's super exciting and something that I would encourage you guys to get involved with. Contact the New Jersey Strike Team if you, are familiar with that group. I've heard from a lot of folks that trying to prioritize or increase native plant gardening is only going to be better if we have better mechanisms for reducing incentives to plant non-native species and invasive species. And so this is a major player in that. If we have this better regulation, nurseries won't be as incentivized to support non-native species, and that just will increase our native stock and make, your jobs a lot easier when you're thinking about native plant gardening. And so this is super exciting and something that's sort of on the works, and I'm sure they would, they'll ask for public input, but, this is a group of people that, I'm sure has a lot of thoughts in terms of what that list should look like and how it could be used. And then at a more general level, something that we've done is sort of come up with a list of recommendations for how to develop a prohibited plant list that's consistent with other states and starts to incorporate climate change. And what I mean by that is, how can we, so if I go back to this map here, how can a state like New Jersey think about what's invasive in its surrounding states, and how can we all basically work together to pool our resources so we don't have this kind of crazy inconsistency across states? We want to make sure that we're using all of our resources as effectively as we can. We want to work together. And so making sure that we sort of follow this workflow to make sure that we have all the species on the list that we want. We're considering risk assessments in other states. We're considering climate change, where things are moving, and all of that good stuff. And so I won't say too much about that other than, I think really what we need to be doing is starting to think a little bit broader, thinking beyond what's going on in our state and thinking about what's happening elsewhere, how all of our environments are shared, and how climate change is making them, even more similar to places further south from us than they were before. And so, trying to think strategically about using all these resources to think a little bit bigger beyond what's going on in New Jersey. And also, the reciprocal of that is just, there's tons of plants that are in New Jersey that are invasive that are going to move into New England. And so we need to make sure we're not helping them with our gardens, right? Like, there's a ton of stuff that's going to be able to spread in the Northeast, further in the Northeast as winters get a little bit more mild. So we don't want to be a source for other people's invasive species. And that's a huge thing with horticulture too. I know New Jersey, I've talked to people in New England that have said that, like, there's a lot of plants that it's just like not hospitable enough to grow there, and land is much more profitable for development and also for timber. And so there's not a lot of nurseries that are growing stock themselves in New England anymore. They're shipping it from places like New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And so we want to make sure that we're not like becoming this source of invasive species to other regions unintentionally. And so thinking about both like what's coming into our state, but also what might be leaving our state, and, the role we have to play in preventing that movement. And so again, like, my group has tried to put together a bunch of resources for thinking about these things. And so the one on the left is a list of range shifting invasive plants. So what are the invasive plants that are headed for the Northeast that we want to keep our eye out for? And then what are the ornamental plants in particular that could get here really fast? So if we are thinking about experimenting with bringing species from the South, what are the riskier species? Like, what do we want to make sure we avoid? And we also, through that, provided some native alternative suggestions. So here's sort of like a little zoom in on what that resource looks like. We identified the invasive species, listed its ecological impacts, and then made some suggestions of aesthetically similar native alternatives. And so this is something also that I think, like, I'd be curious if your group, what you think about this list of species, whether there's better species to have on this. This is available online, and we've already gotten some context or comments from people in the Northeast about this, but always open to more. And so trying again to think about, like, how do we get away from the common non-native and invasive species and focus more on the ecologically beneficial native species that are also, of course, easy to grow and do all the right things. I think it's a big challenge to think about how are we going to produce enough native stock to meet what I hope is a growing demand for native plants, but we have some ideas for where we can start. Okay, so the take homes here are really just that, there's a lot of double-edged swords in this world right now. There's a lot of climate change that's bad for native species, good for invasive species, gardening that's good for native species, bad for invasive species, and so on. There's a lot of like tools in the toolkit, which is exciting. It's a lot to sift through and digest, but we have to be using these resources thoughtfully and thinking strategically about what we put in our gardens. And if we continue to plant so many non-native species, it's just going to perpetuate invasion risk. And that's especially true under climate change. We have this growing body of evidence that invasive species have these advantages already. They're only going to become, stronger advantages as the climate changes. And so we need to make sure that gardens are not sort of the centerpiece in facilitating these invasions, but rather is our, this major opportunity to promote native population persistence. So yeah, just to sort of like repeat what I just said, we want to be thinking about gardens as stepping stones. This is really exciting. This has caused invasions in the past, but it's also, supported pollinator populations in ways that it never has before. I see, like, every time I drove around, I live in Princeton. I was driving around yesterday and I saw a nursery near my house have like a huge native perennial sign. And like, we want to see that, right? Like, we want to see more branding, more advertisements in favor of native plants. And we want that to become the norm, right? We want to be prioritizing not only gardening with native plants, but starting to think about climate resilient native plants and climate resilient native biodiversity. And I think we have some really exciting tools to start building climate change into our approach to this. And it's really essential. And I think there's a lot of promise in thinking about climate resilience as part of native gardening. And I hope I made a case for why that's true. And like I said, we have tons of resources to get started. There's a lot of uncertainty, but I think there's a lot of avenues for future progress in terms of this. And so like I said, I'll make sure that my slides are shared. There's so many more things on the Risk Network website, and I'll make sure this is shared. This is, planting guides, climate change resources, all the above. And then this is really sort of like the source for a lot of the science that I talked about today and the outreach materials, so the gardening pamphlets and things like that. We have a listserv that we send out bi-weekly research summaries. They're really nice. It's like a 2-sentence summary of a new paper on climate change and invasive species. We also share all of our sort of, updates on research materials there. It's not like too much, I promise. It's not that we won't like blast you with 1,000 emails, but it's a really, really useful network to be part of. We're looking to establish more partnerships with people who are gardening and thinking about actually putting these things to practice. And so would love to hear from folks about that and see more people get involved. But with that, I think I'm over time, so I'm going to stop there.
Eve, that was super informative. That was intense.
Yeah, I try to cram in as many things as I can, which I know is not always the best strategy, but
Talking about things that might become invasive. I was recently at the invasive species conference in New Jersey, and they had a presentation on kudzu, which people think of as being invasive down in the South, but there's actually populations here in New Jersey. And they were saying, but it's a late season bloomer, and normally it gets too cold, and so the flowers don't go to seed. But if the season, like you say, if the season gets longer, warmer, longer, it could like all of a sudden explode.
yeah. I think I talked to Mike Van Cleef, who's the strike team guy. They're like, they have their eyes on some populations, but if you know of more, like, tell somebody, because those are like where it starts, right? Like, if we already see it in some people's gardens, like, it's not even 10 years away anymore. It's like way less than that we might start to see that become an issue.
Where all of a sudden the season just got a few more days longer and it could go to seed, then it would really spread.
Yeah, it's scary.
We have a few questions. I'm wondering, do you, so you're talking about taking things from not our normal zone, and, maybe things from Delaware, maybe things from Northern Virginia, and bringing them up here because soon the zones will shift. But do you get pushback from people that are insistent that we should only plant local ecotypes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe what I'll say is that, like, I think we should think of the hardiness zones as local. Well, but maybe they're not local ecotypes, but it's the same species. And it's like, I think we need to be thinking about it seriously. Like, again, I said that I think there are some risks associated with it. And if you can plant the local ecotypes, that's better. But if the local ecotypes are not going to do as well, then they're, what are you left with, right? And I know that these are like sort of hard time horizons to conceptualize because we're thinking about our gardens, on an annual basis within the growing season. And some of these are like, long-term changes that are happening. But I will say that like, sticking to the local ecotypes is good. But if you can think about like, all right, what's something that's not that far away? Maybe it's already in New Jersey and it's in Delaware. And like, that's the species we want to stick around, right? Because it's already going to do well with climate change. Whereas if you have sort of a local ecotype that's already at the sort of southern end of where it can persist, there's a great chance that it's not going to be here anymore. And so I think we can do both. I think we can start to sort of think strategically about, what sort of spans the climates that we currently have and where they'll change, how they'll change, to be strategic about that. And, there's a lot of like local plants here that will do well with climate change and are well adapted to climate change, and just making sure that those are sort of becoming the centerpiece, I think is more like the way we go. But certainly and I appreciate the pushback. I'm way more willing. I love the pushback from the people who want to plant locally than the people who are like, yeah, bring it here. Like, let's bring it from anywhere else. Like, I think being on the cautious side is the right way to go. But again, I think, we've got to sort of meet this middle ground for things that are just already starting to shift.
And I think, in general, you're not saying bring things from Florida, you're saying bring things from a little further south. I know they were saying that, the maples are having a harder time in New Jersey because they can't take the warmer summers. And if the winters are milder, it won't trigger the sap production to get the maple syrup. So that maples are moving north, but more and more magnolias, southern magnolias, that might have been killed off in the winter in the past, are doing well.
Yeah, it's actually funny you mentioned the sugar maples was the example I had in my PowerPoint instead of hemlocks before today. But I was just looking at the US Department of Agriculture. They redid a lot of their climate models, and it looks like sugar maples are going to do better than they originally thought. Like, it's less dramatic. I think New Jersey's sort of right on the cusp where we're starting to lose sugar maple, but a lot of New England was actually not as, predicted to be not as bad as we once thought. And so I was like, oh, okay, I should show a more extreme example. But that's definitely a big concern, I think, especially for a species like that has such economic value, in our region, is it's a scary thing. I think people are starting to get creative in terms of breeding to try to keep things around, but we're trying to help breed and select species that are going to be adapted to warmer temperatures. But yeah, I think it's already happening way more often than we even know.
Let's see, is there anything?
Let's see.
Um,
So I see there's a couple questions about how the sourcing from the southern populations actually helps with reproduction of the existing trees. There was someone who asked, is it hybridizing? It's sort of exactly that. It's basically they have traits and sort of, call them phenotypes, but it's basically traits that are more adapted to the warmer temperatures. So they're just more used to the growing season. They have different bark, or they have different nutrient regimes that, even though it's the same species, they're just a little bit more used to the warmer conditions. And so because of that, they're able to sustain the population and reproduce and hybridize, but it's not even hybridizing because they're the same species. So it's basically taking young, healthy, it's analogous to taking young, healthy individuals and putting them in the middle of the population, and everybody does better because of that. Because you're kind of instead of losing trees every year, you have a more stable population growth and, a more stable ecosystem type in general.
Species, so they intermingle, and they're just transferring the different genes around.
Exactly. It's like your cousin and it's like your cousin in North Carolina who's they're used to the warmer summers, and they're they get it. And so if they, come up here, you're less salty about it because you're used to it. So it's not you're not doing anything dramatic. It's more just you're sort of helping the individuals along that are already used to the changes that we're likely to see.
Somebody asked about the climate change that's not temperature related, but maybe sea level rise and things. And I'm thinking about maybe the salt intrusion, that maybe you have to introduce some more salt tolerant species further inland. That's something too.
Yeah, I don't know as much about that. But I think that's definitely true because we're like also seeing that, at least I was just at Island Beach State Park, and there's a Japanese sedge that is now like when you walk from like the edge of the water inland, like the first plant you see is this Japanese sedge. It's like the only plant that's able to stabilize the dune because it's like salt tolerant as sea level's getting closer. And so unfortunately, some of the species that are the best at that are non-native. Which is concerning, but like, that's definitely a thing that's happening at basically it's shifting all of our ecosystems back a little bit. And so that like the first people on the dune, or the first species on the dune are becoming like, they're only the super salt tolerant species that are staying. And I would assume that that's going to be true. Like, I don't know how far from the ocean edge that applies. Like, I don't know if you need to be thinking about like in Cape May, like the town of Cape May needs to be thinking about like
You
more
have
salt tolerant
the
plants,
ghost
but
forests, where the Atlantic white cedar is dying because of the salt water and
yeah,
things, so even though the trees are used to growing in the water, but they can't tolerate the salt,
right.
you have to bring in trees, hopefully semi-native trees, but that are more salt tolerant.
Yeah.
Another thing I thought about, you were talking originally about the, expanding the season and earlier and later and warmer. Like I've also read that, so maybe the pollen season gets extended too. The pollen season starts earlier, lasts longer. It's bad for allergies.
Yeah, definitely. So one of the biggest pollen producers on the East Coast is ragweed, which is an invasive weed that's like lengthening in the grow, like it's becoming more abundant in the growing season and they're literally producing more pollen grains because they just have more power, energy to grow and a longer season to grow. So yeah, that's definitely, I don't know a lot, I can't say anything about that, but I have heard, at least with ragweed in particular, that some of these like high pollen producing plants that are becoming weedier and more abundant.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they
that's
produce
definitely
more
a thing.
pollen, and that's not good. Um, there's some people that have the questions about, they go to the garden center, they don't have natives, they have neighbors that, they're trying to go native and their neighbors are surrounded, by invasives that keep coming into their yard. I guess, the New Jersey bill is in committee right now. You can write your representatives, call them, say you support that.
Yeah, I think the New Jersey bill is going to be critical. Someone mentioned Euonymus fortunii in particular. That is one that like garden centers never want you to put on a list. And so, like the gardening industry still has a huge influence on a lot of these regulations. I think people respect the regulation once it's in statute, like once it's on the list. And I think, people should as well. I think a lot of times it sort of sits as a resource more than anybody's actually enforcing it. And so what we've been doing is trying to build more capacity at the state level so that like, it's not up to you to like knock on your neighbor's door and say like, hey, but I think the state prohibited plant lists are a good resource. And for our network, we've put together a regional list. So if you compile the list for all of the Northeast and put them together, this is sort of like what you should consider as your regional list of invasive species. And I hope that has some weight. There's a lot of things floating around, but like I think some of the resources we put together, including like the range shifting ones, is a big one. We also have, I didn't put this in there, but I guess some of the graphics I took about like, native plants support more diversity. We have like a 1-page handout, like you can print it, it's beautiful. It has like the key facts that are like why native plants are better. So that's something that I would say like, yeah, if people see that, I think it's interesting, like whether people respond more to saying like, hey, don't plant that, it's bad, versus like, hey, you should plant this, it's really good. And so I think that I'd be curious what this group thinks about that actually, because I think we started with we're like sort of doing both things, but I wonder if like hey, you should plant this instead, it's good, is like a better marketing strategy. But I think if it's on a prohibited plant list, like, people respond to that because they don't want to be doing anything. I think most people, including nurseries, don't want to be like unintentionally doing something wrong, that the government doesn't want them to do. So hopefully in New Jersey, that will be easier.
You need the regulation so that it stops being available,
Yeah.
you know, as long as it's that people will see it and looks nice and they buy it. You know, it needs to be not available. But then, you know, in the other regard, like you say, it's always better to put a positive spin to say, look how beautiful this native plant is. Look at all the bees on it. Look at all the butterflies on it.
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, I've talked to growers in New England that have said like we want more species on the prohibited plant list. Like there's some sticking points. Burning bush is one, Euonymus fortunii is one, calorie pear is going to be an issue. Like there's a handful of stuff that they just make so much money on, they never want it on a regulated list. But there's a lot of people I think that are like, we want you to put it on the prohibited plant list so that our neighbors down the street can't sell it, because like you want to like, it's almost like the equalizer of the market, right? So that people have more opportunities to sell native plants instead of trying to like change
Well,
too many things at
exactly.
once.
Yeah. If you're a commercial, you know, business, you're going to sell what people want to buy. And if the competitor has it, it's hard to,
I see
so,
one. I'm reading through the questions. One person asked, do introduced plants sometimes take a long time to become invasive? The answer is yes, up to decades, which is really weird. We call it time lags. There's sometimes like this is like one of the big unknowns in invasion ecology, because people tend to only start documenting something once it starts to spread. If it's just sort of hanging out, not doing anything, we don't, nobody's really noticing it. And so it's a really hard thing to measure. But there have been, I think, kudzu is an example. Kudzu was introduced to the United States in like the late 1800s. Like it's been here for more than a century. And it took time to like accumulate enough population abundance that we started noticing it. So there's definitely like a weird time lag. So like you said, there's probably stuff here that already that could become invasive, that we need to keep our eye on, because there is like a sort of weird like climate time effect that goes on with some of those. So that's a great question.
somebody asked about, are all these native plants you're talking about, bringing up north, are they deer resistant or deer? I mean, they're all eastern coast plants, and deer are all up and down the East Coast. So,
Yeah. Deer are moving north, but they're not going away anytime soon. I don't think I think I think that I don't recall exactly how we measured deer resistance. I think it's just like, if there's something else, the deer will eat that, is more likely to eat that. But yeah, I'd have to double check. Like, I don't remember exactly what we looked at that for that, but the deer aren't going anywhere anytime soon. That's definitely true.
okay. Well, I think we covered most of the questions, most of the topics. This was really great. Thank you so much. And we'll be posting this video on the website, on YouTube. We'll be putting out the PDF with all your links and resources. And I think that's it. Yeah. Do you have any last words you want to leave us with?
No, just thank you so much. Feel free to send me an email or contact us through that website. I think, like I said, a lot of this is open for feedback. We've published a lot of it, but it's also like, you guys are the gardeners. I want to know, like, unfortunately, I can't live in a place in Princeton where I have a garden. I'm in like a tiny little apartment. So I want to know like what people are doing and what's working. So if you have feedback on the species or other ideas, like let us know, because I think a lot of this, like, as a lot of people pointed out, there's a lot of unknowns, there's a lot of risks, and we're sort of working with the information we have. But I'd be really curious to know, like, if people are already starting to think about this and experimenting with it, and we'd love to hear sort of examples of how that's gone and what people's experiences have been. So yeah, definitely feel free to reach out. I'm also on Twitter, so connect with me there. Anything would be great.
Okay. Thank you so much. Night, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.